You have been sold a massive foundational lie about the book of Genesis. If you walk into any church, synagogue, or even a freshman theology class, you will be handed the exact same tired narrative. Genesis is an ancient, pristine Near Eastern document, a solitary transmission from the desert sands, untouched by the outside world. We are routinely told it is the original, independent blueprint of monotheism. But when you strip away the centuries of theological propaganda and actually examine the literary architecture of the text, that entire religious narrative completely collapses. Genesis is absolutely not the oldest book in the room. It is a highly calculated, politically motivated, and incredibly late piece of Hellenistic literature. And its primary source material is not a divine voice from a burning bush. Its source material is Greek. Today, we are going entirely off the approved theological script. We are going to tear down the manufactured illusion of an independent Genesis and expose exactly how the biblical creation story was reverse-engineered from Greek mythology and Platonic philosophy. The scribes who compiled the Pentateuch were not operating in a cultural vacuum. They were elite, highly educated redactors working in a world completely saturated by Greek intellectual tradition. And their primary template for how the universe began was not some ancient Hebrew oral tradition, it was Plato. If you want to understand the opening chapters of the Bible, you do not look at Moses, you look at Plato's Timaeus. In the Timaeus, Plato introduces the concept of the demiurge, a supreme craftsman god who fashions the physical cosmos out of chaotic matter, bringing rational order to the universe. This is the exact cosmological blueprint that the biblical redactors lifted to create the opening act of Genesis. They needed a cosmic origin story that could compete on the Hellenistic world stage, so they appropriated the Greek philosophical framework of cosmic monotheism and overlaid it onto their own localized tribal myths. They deliberately masked the terrestrial polytheism of the ancient Canaanite world with the sophisticated singular craftsman deity borrowed straight from the Athenian academies. We have to stop treating the Bible as primary historical document. It is not history. It is a heavily edited, multi-century redactional product designed to construct a retroactive national identity. The authors of Genesis were looking directly at the Greeks, meticulously mapping out their own origin story to mirror the dominant cultural superpowers of their time. They took the intellectual property of Greek philosophers and seamlessly repackaged it as divine Hebrew revelation. And for thousands of years, the religious establishment has desperately tried to hide this blatant theological plagiarism. But the literary fingerprints are everywhere. And once you see the Greek scaffolding holding up the book of Genesis, you will never look at the Bible the same way again. Close your eyes and picture the Garden of Eden, lush vegetation springing spontaneously from the earth, humans living in perfect harmony with animals, a state of absolute innocence where men and women are naked and unashamed, and the divine being physically dwelling among them, managing their every lead. You have been told your entire life that this is a uniquely biblical vision of paradise, a pure Hebrew original. It is not. The Garden of Eden is a direct, undeniable copy-paste job from Greek philosophy. Long before the biblical redactors ever put ink to parchment, the Greeks had already perfected this exact mythology. They called it the Age of Kronos. To understand Eden, you have to stop reading Genesis as history and start reading it as Hellenistic literary appropriation. The authors of the Pentateuch did not invent the concept of a primordial utopia. They lifted it straight from the pages of Plato's Statesman. In Plato's text, the Age of Kronos is explicitly described as a pre-technological era. During this golden age, the god Kronos lived directly with humanity. He ruled them the way a shepherd tends to his flock. The earth spontaneously produced abundant vegetation without the need for grueling human agriculture. The people were naked, they had no need for shelter, they lived without shame, and they conversed directly with the animals. Sound familiar? It should. It is the exact unadulterated blueprint for Genesis 2. The Hebrew scribes looked at this sophisticated Greek philosophical model of a pre-civilizational paradise and decided to claim it as their own. They simply swapped out Kronos, inserted Yahweh, and rebranded the narrative for a Judean audience. Theologians will bend over backward to try and protect the sanctity of Eden. They will tell you that the striking similarities are just a coincidence, or they will fabricate theories about a shared ancient memory. Do not buy that apologetic nonsense for a single second. The parallels are far too precise, the literary framing too exact. The biblical writers were highly educated elites operating in a Hellenistic world dominated by Greek thought, and they were intentionally synthesizing these foreign texts to elevate their own national deity. Yahweh walking through the garden in the cool of the day is not a historical memory of a localized desert god. It is the Greek shepherd deity Kronos taking a stroll through his mythological utopia. When you strip away the layers of forced theology, the story of Eden entirely loses its sacred aura. It is not a historical account of original sin, and it certainly is not divine revelation. It is human psychology mapped onto a mythic past, a fundamental yearning for a time before the brutal labor of agriculture and the violent complexities of civilization. The rabbis and scribes successfully hid this Greek origin for centuries to protect the illusion of divine inspiration. But the truth is carved into the very texts they plagiarized. Why does humanity suddenly invent cities, metalworking, and music the exact moment they are violently expelled from paradise? If you read the text as literal history, it makes zero sense. But if you read it as Hellenistic mythology, the code immediately cracks open. We have already established that the Garden of Eden is the Greek age of Kronos. So what happens when that idyllic, pre-technological utopia collapses? You enter the age of Zeus. And just like the transition from Kronos to Zeus in Greek tradition, Genesis abruptly shifts from a pastoral paradise into a gritty, desperate age of technological survival. In the Greek mythos, the age of Zeus is defined by divine abandonment. The gods retreat to their heavenly domains, leaving humanity entirely defenseless against the brutal, unforgiving natural world. To survive, humans desperately need the arts of civilization. They need fire, they need metallurgy, and they need independence. This forbidden knowledge is famously delivered by the rogue titan Prometheus. He disobeys the supreme deity to gift humanity the very tools of their survival, and he is brutally punished for his rebellion. Now look directly at the book of Genesis. The parallels are not just thematic, they are structural, surgical, and undeniable. The Hebrew redactors needed a mechanism to transition their narrative from the utopian Eden into the harsh realities of human history, so they borrowed the Promethean archetype and cast him as a serpent. The serpent in Eden is absolutely not Satan. That is a massive theological retcon invented centuries later by Christian apologists desperate to insert a cosmic villain into a text that never actually had one. In the original literary framework, the serpent is Prometheus. He brings the forbidden knowledge that opens the eyes of humanity. He forces the painful transition from helpless innocence to conscious independence. And exactly like Prometheus, the serpent is instantly cursed by the supreme deity for breaking the divine monopoly on enlightenment. Once humanity is cast out of the garden and completely abandoned by their divine caretaker, they are forced to build civilization from scratch. The very next chapter of Genesis is a sudden, rapid-fire catalog of human invention. Cain builds the first city. Jabal initiates nomadic livestock herding. Jubal invents the lyre and the pipe. Tubal-Cain pioneers the forging of bronze and iron tools. This is not a historical registry of ancient ancestors. This is a highly stylized literary trope mapping perfectly onto the Greek technological era. The authors of the Pentateuch are trying to process the traumatic origins of human technology. They frame the terrifying shift from hunter-gatherer simplicity to urban metalworking through a lens of profound psychological anxiety. They took the Promethean myth, stripped it of its Greek names, and dressed it up in Judean clothing. They rebranded a titan as a reptile, but the mythological engine driving the story remains completely, unmistakably Greek. Think of the most famous cataclysm in human history. A supreme deity looks down at a completely corrupted world, regrets his own creation, and unleashes a catastrophic global flood to hit the reset button. We are told this is the righteous judgment of Yahweh in the days of Noah. But once again, the biblical authors are passing off foreign mythology as divine history. While Sunday school teachers and apologetic historians focus entirely on the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, they are deliberately missing the much more sophisticated Hellenistic theft happening right in front of them. The biblical flood narrative, specifically its bizarre supernatural preamble in Genesis chapter 6, is a plagiarized redaction of Plato's Atlantis myth. Let's look at the actual trigger for the biblical flood. Before a single drop of rain falls, Genesis tells us that the sons of God came down to earth, saw that human women were attractive, and took them as wives. Their offspring were the Nephilim, the mighty men of old, the legendary men of renown. Theologians will tie themselves into absolute knots trying to explain away this deeply embarrassing polytheistic remnant. They invent elaborate, desperate theories about fallen angels or the righteous line of Seth to protect the illusion of strict biblical monotheism. Ignore every single word of it. This is a direct injection of Greek mythology into the Hebrew text. In Plato's Critias, the destruction of the utopian civilization of Atlantis is triggered by the exact same mechanism. The divine bloodline of the gods mixes with mortal women, diluting their pure divine nature and filling the earth with violent, arrogant, and corrupt hybrids. When the supreme god, Zeus in the Greek text, looks down and sees this catastrophic genetic and moral corruption, he decides to wipe them out completely with a devastating cataclysm. The elite scribes who authored the early chapters of Genesis were looking directly at the Atlantis myth and mapping it seamlessly onto their own flood narrative. They needed a cosmic justification for a global reset that would resonate in a world heavily influenced by Greek philosophical traditions. So they did what they always do. They synthesized. They merged the ancient Near Eastern water myths with the Platonic narrative of divine mortal interbreeding and ultimate total destruction. Yahweh is just wearing a Zeus mask. The biblical flood is not a historical geological event, and it's certainly not a profound moral lesson from an independent creator. It is a carefully constructed editorial mashup designed to compete with Greek literature. The religious establishment successfully hid the Hellenistic origins of this myth for centuries, but the structural parallels are utterly undeniable once you actually look at the source code. If a solitary man named Moses did not write the first 5 books of the Bible in the desolate sands of the Sinai desert, then who actually did it, and where did they do it? For centuries, religious institutions have sold you the complete fabrication of an isolated prophet taking direct dictation from Yahweh. Even modern critical scholars often miss the mark. They will hand you the classic documentary hypothesis, arguing that isolated Hebrew authors slowly passed down oral traditions in a pristine Israelite bubble centuries before the Greeks arrived. But they refuse to interrogate why that insulated narrative serves their own agenda. It protects the text from being exposed as a late derivative product. Neither of these narratives account for the glaring, undeniable Greek philosophical framework we just exposed. You cannot copy Plato if you're standing in a cultural vacuum in the Bronze Age. The true birthplace of the Pentateuch, exactly as we have it today, is not a desert tent. It is the intellectual epicenter of the ancient world, the Hellenistic Library of Alexandria. Look at the bizarre, disjointed nature of Genesis. You have heavy Babylonian influence, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, layered right next to sophisticated Athenian philosophy. You have ancient Canaanite tribal folklore colliding violently with Greek cosmic monotheism. How do all these completely disparate international sources end up stitched together into a single scroll? There is only one logical environment where a redaction of this immense magnitude could occur. You need a location that holds all of these global collections in one single place. You need an environment where brilliant, highly educated scribes could sit down, pull from multiple contradictory texts, and piece together a definitive national epic. The scribes who finalized the Pentateuch were not isolated desert wanderers. They were cosmopolitan elites operating in a profoundly Hellenized environment, likely in or deeply connected to Alexandria during the 3rd century BCE. They were living in a world completely dominated by Greek culture, Greek military power, and Greek intellectual superiority. To survive on that aggressive global stage and to maintain a distinct, legitimate national identity, they desperately needed a foundational literature that could stand toe-to-toe with the legendary works of Homer and Plato. So they built one from scratch. They took their local Judean deities and tribal laws, elevated them using the sophisticated conceptual framework of the Greek demiurge and wove in Mesopotamian mythologies to create a massive, politically motivated anthology. They were not recording ancient, infallible history. They were engineering a retroactive heritage. When theologians insist on an early, independent dating for the Torah, they are desperately trying to protect the text from its own obvious Hellenistic DNA. The Pentateuch is a brilliant piece of synthetic political literature, compiled by operators who weaponized the greatest library in the ancient world to invent a divine history that never actually happened. Why does an all-knowing deity need to promise twice that he will never again drown the planet? And why are we expected to believe that the Pharaoh of Egypt, the most powerful man in the ancient world, with a harem of the most beautiful women on earth, completely lost his mind with uncontrollable lust over a 90-year-old woman? When you read the Bible through the lens of theological indoctrination, you are trained to ignore these glaring absurdities. You are told to view them as divine mysteries or testaments to miraculous intervention. Stop making excuses for a deeply flawed text. These are not divine mysteries. They are the undeniable, clumsy fingerprints of desperate human redactors who were forced to stitch incompatible myths into one exceptionally messy book. Look at the flood narrative. When you actually disentangle the text, you do not find a single coherent historical account. You find two completely different flood myths violently mashed together. Because these scribes were merging disparate sources, they ended up with incredible narrative redundancy. The text literally has God promising not to flood the earth and then immediately making the exact same promise again. If they had simply placed one flood myth right after the other, the reader would think the deity promised to stop, changed his mind, and drowned everyone a second time. So the redactors chopped the stories up and intertwined them. They compromised the narrative integrity to appease different political factions who demanded their specific version of the myth be included in the final cut. The exact same political desperation explains the patriarchs. Genesis contains 3 remarkably similar stories where a patriarch lies to a foreign king, claiming his wife is actually his sister, to save his own skin. These are obvious, transparent variations of the exact same folktale, but because different sects held on to their favorite version, the redactors lacked the authority to cut any of them. They spaced them out with filler material, resulting in the unintentionally hilarious timeline where a 90-year-old Sarah is paraded as an irresistible temptation to a foreign king. Apologists will humiliate themselves trying to defend this nonsense, claiming humans magically live longer or age slower in the ancient world. You are making yourselves look ridiculous by defending a text that the authors themselves knew was a compromised anthology. The contradictions in Genesis absolutely destroyed the claim of divine authorship. This is not the infallible word of a supreme being. It is the chaotic, highly political result of a committee of scribes who shoved a dozen conflicting Hellenistic and Near Eastern puzzle pieces into one box and hammered them down until they fit. The myth of an independent, pristine Genesis is officially dead. You are not reading the literal dawn of humanity. You are reading a calculated Hellenistic mashup. From Plato's utopian age of Kronos and Eden, to the Promethean serpent delivering forbidden civilization, to a localized version of Atlantis drowning the world, the Greek philosophical scaffolding holding up the Bible is impossible to unsee once exposed. The scribes in Alexandria did not receive a divine transmission. They just stripped the greatest literary hits of the ancient world and changed the names to protect the guilty. If you want exclusive content, early access to videos, and want to support this rational quest, consider joining our YouTube membership community. You become part of the family, helping us navigate this rich tapestry of ancient narratives. I'm Farid. Keep delving, keep questioning, and stay curious.